Right, Fee, I'm going to make a start. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's assessment morning and a bit. So welcome and thank you for joining us. We are here from 9 o'clock until 10 o'clock, but I will go through the order of the day. My name is Lisa Ling, and I have the privilege of overseeing the secondary schools for whole education. And I am delighted to be joined by a group of experts and panelists today. I've just made these hopefully bigger on your screens too. So I'm just going to go through and introduce who is joining us for this assessment morning. We have David Crossley, who's going to be facilitating and will in turn introduce some of the panelists again. So welcome, David, and thank you for giving up your time and also for producing the blog, which we shared for Whole Education yesterday. Hilary is a senior publisher for GL Assessment, and again, this is a Whole Education and GL collaboration. So thank you, Hilary, and Hilary's going to be presenting each section. Verity Kane, who's one of my colleagues at Whole Education, who works on projects and also oversees the secondaries.
Good morning.
And Verity is going to be taking your questions today, if you have any, which you can post in the Q&A section. If you leave the chat for any technical issues or any comments that you wish to make that are not part of the questions that we want to pose to the panelists. Moving on to Andy Daly, who's the Executive Principal and Cross-Trust Lead for Cambridge Meridians Academy Trust. Welcome, Andy.
Hello.
Hi, and thank you ever so much for joining us and giving up your time at what is a very, very busy time for senior leaders, as we know. Darren Lamb, who is the head of the Multi-Academy Trusts for GL. So welcome, Darren.
Morning, thank you, Lisa.
And we're going to be hearing from Darren and Dan, who I'll go to next, not quite in order, but who will be explaining how GL can hopefully solve a lot of our assessment issues, problems and queries at the moment. So welcome also to Dan Sims, who's one of the GL directors overseeing sales and business development. Welcome, Dan.
Morning.
Morning. Zara Pescott is one of the senior leaders, an assistant head at Shenley Brookend, and also a cross-trust lead for 5 Dimensions, and a bit of a GL stroke PASS expert. So we're very much looking forward to hearing from you, Zara. Morning.
Morning, everyone.
And thank you again for giving up your time. Sam Rayner, again, GL expert, part of the Cambridge Meridians Academy Trust, and also assistant head at Ely College.
Hello.
Have I got that right, Sam? Is that the right?
Yeah, that's right. That's me.
Brilliant, fantastic. And Tim Munro, a senior lead at Wilmslow, again goes without saying, a GL aficionado as well. So thank you ever so much, Tim, for joining us today.
Thank you.
In the background, we have Fee, who is behind the Whole Education. She's the tech whiz that you've been speaking to. If you have any issues, then please do go to Fee. And Alex Hardiman, who's going to be collecting some of the main points from today and sharing them with you. And also Alex is somebody who regularly sort of shares information about GL and about Whole Education through our website. Right, I'm just going to move the panel to the side and just go from there. So Whole Education Network, just very briefly, if you are interested in finding out more, then please do visit the Whole Education website. Also, please do visit the GL website. But we are a not-for-profit, values-led network of schools, and hopefully during the course of the morning you will find out more about us. And as part of our network, we are really interested in assessment and what assessment can look like post this crisis. And of course, we will find out more about that today from our speakers. Just going through what the day looks like. We are starting off with a session on transition and looking at what successful transition and assessment for successful transition could look like in the future, has looked like in the past. There won't be a break, but we urge you, whilst you can turn off your sort of move away from the computer, that you stay on during that break, but there will be a break where the panel will sort of not be available. And then session 2 at 10:15, we're going to be looking at some key learning gaps. Again, we'll introduce that at the time, going on to why reading matters in session 3, and then looking at students' attitudes and how we're going to be assessing attitudes to learning and to study post this crisis. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to David Crossley, who's going to open the morning's proceedings for us.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. An absolute joy to be with you this morning, and really looking forward to hearing the contributions. We're so used to face-to-face conferences. This is probably the largest one we've been involved in, and I hope it works for you all. Certainly do use the chat function. We've also got the hashtag WE in capital letters assessment to tweet any thoughts or comments. And as Lisa said, there's the Q&A function. So any thoughts or things you'd like to raise or be picked up and we'll do that in the last 10 minutes of each session between 9, for example, between 9:50 and 10 in the first. So any thoughts, questions, observations, comments, certainly use that function, because with, I don't know how many people are we up to at the moment for you who've already signed in?
284.
Okay, because I know we've got over 400, so 284 of you are real welcome so far. Stay as long as you can. Unlike a real conference, when we go off for cakes and coffee and things at 10 o'clock, we've got to do that and we can't chat to people, but maybe make sure we have the cakes and coffee in those short breaks, but always be back by 10:15. As I said in the blog, I'm a bit of a data enthusiast, but I've never been a data geek. But there were some formative experiences in my own career that convinced me of the importance of being data informed, not data driven. And one of the things that saddened me a great deal is because we've become so heavily focused on post-mortem assessment and high stakes accountability, it's lessened our focus on, to me, the prime purpose of using data, which is to really help us know our students better and know their potential. And the other thing, as for those of us in higher education, we often feel that although we collect an awful lot of data, we collect an awful lot of the same type of data, predominantly about academic attainment and using it for predictions. So whilst that's important, and I wouldn't decry its importance, it's more important to a government, a locality, or even a trust or a school than it is for an individual teacher. For me, the real importance of data is to help teach us to best meet the learning needs of each student in our care and give us that guide on the side that really helps us and challenges, gives us hypotheses to test, identifies students we may not have noticed as often, and really help them realize their potential. An absolute delight for me was the unintended consequence of COVID-19 when suddenly, instead of hours and hours of our students sitting in serried lines taking high stakes public examinations and terminal examinations as the main decider on how they do, overnight almost, teachers were invited to grade students. I've always believed this would be almost as accurate an endeavour as sitting an examination paper. For two reasons. One is almost a simple statistical reason that most children and young people do as we would expect in most schools in the country. But in addition to that, we know we can help ourselves know how they will do better. And that's by a combination of teacher assessment and good use of data, and particularly standardized data. And that's one of the joys of working with GL, is that standardized data can identify and help predict. Then there's the wonderful experience of us being with our students every day in our schools. And you put those two things together and you've got a pretty reliable way of suggesting how children and young people will do. And certainly in my time as an examiner and also working for a big national not-for-profit, when we were looking at how children and young people actually did, we found it's not a lottery, and it is much easier to predict than we think. And a combination of good standardized data and our own judgment from knowing our students is, to me, a particularly powerful way of making judgments. And that's why in some ways I'm relatively relaxed about the quality of predictions that will be made this summer. So to me, the combination of teacher assessment and formative rather than summative data is particularly powerful. And I hope that will be one of the things that comes across clearly as we progress through this morning. There are a couple of events in my career that reinforce these beliefs. When I knew very little about data and was probably skeptical, a researcher working for, at the time, one of the country's leading professors knocked on my school door and said, did we know that students did better in our school than similar students elsewhere? And I have to say, although we thought we did well, we didn't really know that. And it was a particularly piece of good news. It was my introduction to the concept of adding value. The second experience was less good news when I had my first full Ofsted, when the inspector knocked on the school door, and one of the first things he said, I think almost after saying his name, was, you have one of the biggest gaps between boy and girl attainment in your school. And because of that researcher who knocked on my door some years earlier and the conversations with the academic, I could answer with confidence, we know, you can't see those students now because they've left. And actually, we worked on the issue of boys' attainment for 5 years, and those boys had an average IQ of 89, and the girls were 101 at the time. And actually, the boys did better than you'd think. So that allowed me to talk with confidence, but it also allowed us to respond over 5 years to the needs of those students better than we would have done otherwise. Working with whole education, one of the things that we've begun to look much more at is the notion of measuring what we value and making choices at a wider range of data. Working with GL, we looked at more closely at the CATS scores. So often they're just used to predict GCSE results, which is a very limited use. Obviously, they have much greater potential if they're used more formatively and helping us to understand students and how they learn, but also to identify hypotheses to test. I was always interested in students with higher non-verbal reasoning than verbal reasoning as an indication of potential that might be untapped, and also particular learning behaviours and attributes that can help us plan for those students. Assessment for learning was a popular thing and still is, but sometimes we underuse it under the weight of more conventional accountability measures and uses of data. And finally, as we'll have a session this morning, attitude is a great indicator of how well students will do. It's one of those variable factors that can help you do better or worse if you've got a negative or a positive attitude. So engaging with the notion of attitude is very powerful. And a combination of a teacher perception of attitude and again the past pupil attitude to self and school survey again can help us be proactive rather than reactive. And that's one of my great hopes in use of data. The more we are proactive, we can do something about it. The more we rely on post-mortem data, it could be useful for future generations of students, but it's very little use to the student we're talking about who has by that time left our care. So this morning, we're looking about how schools in our network are seizing the agenda. Responding both to immediate challenges about feeling we know little or less than we would have done normally about the students who are moving to us in the first session, but also looking at more longer term challenges about what we might do differently and how we might seize the opportunity. And this is something that will not be the end of the conversation this morning. It's an ongoing conversation in the network. And if you're not already part of us, you're very strongly welcome to join the network and be involved in those conversations, involved in not only sharing practice, but also developing practice as we work together, bounce ideas off each other and bring thoughts and suggestions into fruition of real practice that benefits children and young people in our care. That's enough from me to introduce the session. We're now going to move to session one. Each session will begin with some input from Hilary on what we know about the research, and I'll hand over to them, and then some contributions from practitioners in the network. And we'll end with some of the suggestions that GL make from their products that may be useful. So I'm delighted to hand over to Hilary, who will open our session on how we can help ourselves know more about those students who are joining us in September. Hilary.
Thank you very much, David. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'd like to start just by acknowledging what's been going on for the last few months, because I think as we get ready to sort of return to school in its entirety, although some schools are back in part, it's probably useful to reflect on what's been happening and the challenges that have resulted from what's been happening with teaching and learning at this time. And I'd like to just start with saying that I think schools have been absolutely amazing in how they have tried to ensure continuity of learning after everybody had to leave the school building and essentially start learning from home. And when we talk to our schools and we've sort of reached out to them and tried to understand the approaches they've taken, there's a really wide range of approaches to how they carry on learning with their pupils. And the approaches also are trying to meet the pupils where they are, where those school communities are. So there are differing approaches that schools have adopted. They've had to do it really quickly without much guidance, and everybody's kind of finding their way. And teachers have put a huge amount of energy and effort into staying connected to their students at this time and to also ensure that they are learning. In terms of whether or not they're learning, I think that for us has become quite an interesting question, in that what we're seeing is a huge amount of teaching and a lot of task assessment, assignment, but not necessarily a huge amount of understanding about how much learning has taken place. And a lot of that is to do with the fact that the teacher isn't seeing the children day to day and can't actually reflect on whether or not they have understood what has been presented through a lesson or what has been assigned. And while some schools are doing feedback and assessment, others haven't quite got to grips with that. So I think there are varying practices that are going on. And when students do return to school, it will be hard to know which students have learned what's been assigned during this period of time, or they've been asked to learn during this period of time, and which students are still struggling. So I think on return to school, there'll definitely be gaps in learning, which we'll have to make visible and have to understand better. We'll have to determine a baseline for a lot of students, where their reading is, and most importantly, whether their attitudes to learning have changed during this time and what impact that's going to have moving forward. In this first session, we're going to look at the students who are moving from primary to secondary school. So they will have missed out on that vital last term of primary school, where teachers prepare them a lot in terms of building their independence as learners, building their independence just as children, being able to manage a timetable, a much bigger school environment for a lot of them. None of that will have happened. So there'll be a lot there about settling them in and getting them to understand how secondary school works, probably more so than in previous years. On top of all of that, David's point about having information about students to enable them to be able to help them better. One of the pieces of information that will be missing this year are the Key Stage 2 SATs. So secondary schools will not have that national test data for students. They will have to rely on the primary schools giving them some kind of information. I've heard of primary schools that have been asked by their secondary schools to fill out quite extensive forms on children to say exactly where they are in their learning. But really, that vital piece of data that secondary schools are quite used to getting won't be there. And when children are moving from primary to secondary, it's also going to be really important to understand where they are in terms of reading level, in terms of, as I said previously, their attitudes and their well-being and their adjustment to their secondary setting. So I'm going to hand over to my colleagues, Darren and Dan, who are going to talk more about how GL can help in terms of the transition between primary and secondary.
Thank you ever so much, Hilary. We're actually moving on to Andy, to the schools next. So we will have Andy Daly, again introducing Andy from Cambridge Meridian Academies Trust, and has very kindly given up his time to talk about how Cambridge Meridian Academy Trust and the schools have assessed and used GL and other means of assessing year sevens in the past, and what they're grappling with and how they're looking to go forward beyond this crisis. So thank you ever so much, Andy, and I think you're going to be made a larger sort of screen view at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we'll start talking about how we approached transition previously. Obviously, all of that is very much up in the air at the moment. We've had some, we are working collectively across our trust with schools on supporting that going forward, but I wouldn't say we have all the answers at all. So in terms of how we have approached that, a number of our schools have worked very closely with their partner primary schools so that the CATS assessments could be conducted at the end of year 6, so before they came up to secondary school, which was really beneficial in terms of having some of that CATS data, yes, on a simplistic level to triangulate with SATs and to perhaps identify some of those students who might have underperformed in their SATs. But also we used it quite carefully within our SEND graduated approach to identify where gaps might be in terms of learning, and so that has been one key way in which that has supported identification of individuals. All of our schools teach in mixed ability groups in year 7. A big part of that is because they need time to get to know those students, to assess where they are, and to make sure that there's no cap on their aspiration as they go forward. When they arrive, we use the GL progress test in English, Maths and Science. So that gives us an identification of specific gaps in knowledge that we might have in those particular subject areas beyond what we would have already received from the question level analysis. I think obviously that's going to be key going forward. We still have the question about when we might do that this year, whether we will have everyone back in September to be able to, as we normally would do. It also establishes a baseline in those subjects that staff don't have to mark themselves. So having that question level analysis that we haven't had to internally assess at the start has been useful. There's then other baselines. So across the trust, there are common baseline assessments. So in art, for example, we have a baseline assessment that staff will use to identify the skills that students have got and therefore to shape the support that they might need going forward. Those are looked at and moderated across. So in terms of, again, sharing where our students are coming in at, what our curriculum might need to look like in terms of addressing any gaps as they go forward. That's a key area that we can do and share between colleagues across the trust. I think in terms of the journey through year 7, as I said, we're generally taught in mixed ability groups. That enables us to shape what their year 8 will look like. At the end of year 7, we'll use the progress tests again to benchmark the progress that students are making. Our assessment as we go through in terms of what's reported home is really simplistic. So we use a very simple P plus, P minus system in terms of saying whether students are making progress, making rapid progress, or making less than expected progress. So that's something that we have intentionally kept very simple in terms of our quality assurance and in terms of looking across and being able to say how students are getting on and feedback to parents without making it complex for every different individual subject, and also pinning it to GCSE criteria that I know have seen, which is obviously very complicated in terms of where students might be when they're in year 7. So going forward, obviously we're grappling like everyone else is with how that might be adjusted come September. We haven't made any firm decisions on that yet because actually we're not in a position to, we don't feel, until we fully understand where we're going to be. Obviously, as you all have, we've all got the challenge of managing the 3 schools that we have at the moment, our online school, vulnerable and key worker school, and our year 10 and 12 school. So in terms of then thinking about what schemes of work learning, what curriculum might look like in September, we still feel it's a bit early to be focusing on that in any great detail at the moment without further information about when that point might start. We have started looking quite carefully at what the transition for year 6 into year 7 might look like. again, still waiting to be clear on what the guidance will be on whether staff could go out and work. Obviously, we're pretty clear that Year 6 can't come into the school by the end of term. So again, that's all got to be very different from what it was in the past. One conversation that has been quite interesting over the last few weeks is talking with GL about the possibility of the integration with the Fisher Family Trust. So our schools have worked quite closely with FFT in terms of understanding that and understanding the choices and chances graphs in terms of identifying the potential minimum target where students might get to. But exactly like David said earlier, we have a pretty strong focus on the data only ever making us ask a question rather than giving us any particular answers.
Thank you, Andy. That's brilliant. And thank you for your thoughts. There are a couple of things we can pick up later. I'm looking at some of the comments coming in as well. There is that distinction between standardized tests and SATs. I mean, it's interesting what you feel is more reliable. I certainly tend to put my money behind a standardized test, but it's that combination, looking at some of the comments coming in, and we'll come back to Andy on that. And I like the notion of simple, keeping assessment simple, Andy, which is very powerful. We now go over to Tim in Wilmslow. Tim's worked a lot on developing practice with colleagues in whole education, as well as in his own school. And Tim would like to join us and reflect on some of your thoughts on transition.
Thank you, David. Were we clear at the start as to how people are going to ask those questions? Are they coming through in the chat?
They're coming through in the chat, and I'm going to act as a conduit through to you on them, and you can probably see them going through. And if there's particular things you want to respond to, Tim, hold that for the last session, if there's things you've noticed as well.
Super, thank you. I feel a bit of a fraud because I'm now going to basically say what Andy just said, except I've got some pretty pictures to share with you as well. So if anything, that goes to highlight the fact that we're all in the same sort of situation, particularly those of us who are heavy GL users. Just a bit of context about our school. Wilmslow High School is a very large 11 to 18 comprehensive in Wilmslow, which is just south of Manchester. Next year we'll have 345 coming into Year 7. And we're also a GL Centre of Assessment Excellence. So across the years, we've used CATS for many years. I picked up one of the comments there about assumptions made on CATS and people's understanding of them, that I think is very true, that we've done those for many years and done absolutely nothing with that information other than to think about GCSE grades. We've moved that on and we now use the full GL progress test series as well as CATS, and we also use with some of our targeted students the new group reader test, which I think you'll be discussing in the later sessions. Worth sharing with you the principles that we have when we're thinking about assessment, particularly for students in transition, but also the way we think about assessment across the school. We were very proud for many years about the quality of our pastoral transition. For a big school, we had good relationships pastorally with our partner primaries. We have 9 primary schools from whom we take the vast majority of their children. But we were weak, if we were very honest, at genuinely knowing our students through Key Stage 3, knowing that kind of lost middle. That the wasted years as a document was one that really resonated with us. So we make it our key to know the learning gaps, both individually and as a cohort. And one of the key parts of that is the nature of the relationship we have with our primaries. It's certainly true to say that 5-6 years ago, there was a good level of distrust in any of the information that we had. We're talking back in the era of levels here, with the information that came through, which didn't lead to a very positive relationship academically, albeit the pastoral one was strong, in knowing where the gaps were and getting the right kids in the right places. We've moved that on, and that's been alongside actually the work we've done with GL and the work we've done with transition tests, which has really facilitated some great conversations with our primary schools. A couple of principles that we say, we hope nice and simply, about what we think about assessment. We believe in assessing summatively rarely and reliably. We only capture data twice a year, and we capture that after Christmas and in the summer term, but we do base that on standardised assessments within the school that lean heavily on the data we get from GL to help quality assure those. So that's across all of our subjects, but we only do that twice a year. But we have an expectation of constant formative assessment in our classrooms. So, you know, we're assessing all the time, but we're capturing data very rarely. This is the map of our normal type of transition, and this is exactly what Andy was talking about from his point of view. Actually, our discussions with our primary schools kick off in April and May, and that's a pastoral-led conversation, but which does then focus, because we've developed that relationship, to have the conversation around, okay, you're going to have children at the end of year 6 who are going to be meeting the standard, they're going to be coming in at 101, 102. Which of those children have done that because they've successfully responded to all of the coaching that's been going on in the primary schools? Now, historically, we would have viewed that very cynically. Now we look at that and say, okay, we've got kids here who can respond to that. We need to know that so we can start that process again for them in year 7 so that we don't lose that by the time they turn 15 and 16. Just like Andy, our primary schools do the CATS test for me. They do that online. We do that as part of our transition process. We explain it to the children when they come in for their transition days, but they do that back in their primary school, with the exception of those who come from non-feeder primaries, who I have in school for a day to do that. What we then do when we have the SAT results, we put those SAT results onto the same scale. We take the scale score, we put it onto a standardized scale which matches that of the CAT, so we can start comparing apples and apples. In September, we run the transition tests. I'm dead honest with this with the kids and their parents. It's pretty brutal. We do it when they come in the first full week, and we take 3 mornings and we get them in the sports hall, and I have 340 kids sitting doing those tests. And it's, you know, I do feel bad about that, but actually it gives us the information that we need, and we're dead honest and upfront about that. We then look, once we get the results for those, because we do them on paper, they take longer to come, we start doing some gap analysis. I thought I'd share with you actually a little bit about what that might look like. So here at the top of the screen is the kind of nature of the prior data that we might have. And as you look down the screen, you can see recorded those scores. You'd be interested then in this child here, where what that's flagging up is huge disparity between CAT scores, Key Stage 2 tests. In some cases, I'm looking at maths, the GL assessment, the transition test, and their Key Stage 2 score, and we triangulate that with the information that we've had from the primary schools to be thinking about, okay, why is that? What is it that the gaps are there? We'll use the question by question analysis in the math stuff. I thought this child would be an interesting one to look at as an example of how we'll need to work this year. We don't get many children coming in without Key Stage 2 data. You can see from a comment in the Key Stage 2 mean score column there, this child's come from an independent primary school. So we've not got that, but we do then have this vast array of other bits of information that we can look at to produce a baseline, a standardized score baseline for that child, which is in that PB. PB, we talk about personal best, and the aim that children are always trying to beat their personal best on any assessment that they're doing. Based on that standardized score. So that's the source of information, actually, that second child down, that we're more likely to be able to get from what's left, which is we've had those transition conversations, learning gaps, and finding out about, I suppose, realistically, whether or not the children would have responded to coaching. We'll run the transition tests somehow in September, I don't know how yet, and then be able to run that through until November, to when we adapt our curriculum and put things on for those students. But I think in reality that when I think back to those principles that I started from, losing the Key Stage 2 scores isn't going to cause us too great a worry because of the wealth of data that we have. So for September 2020, we've had those quality transition conversations. All of our years will run a 3-week transition for at the start, where somehow we'll put into that lots of forms of assessing, and in terms of those year 7 students, the transition tests. Like Andy, we teach everything mixed ability except maths, but our maths team will start with mixed ability maths teaching so that we can then get the children into the right groups based on that lack of Key Stage 2 score. That's the only thing we would have used historically to get some semblance of accurate grouping at the start of year 7. So we will have to start running in mixed ability maths teaching there. And I'll hope at some point to get some CATS tests done, but I see that as the lowest of my priorities there.
Thank you, Tim. That's great to hear. Again, looking at comments on the chat, Tim actually brought up that issue of using data to give you hypotheses to test and looking for students that don't follow a pattern. And the key is, of course, what teachers do to investigate and become clearer about that. One of the concerns from the large number of schools who use CATS test is they're used in too limited a way, but Jiell's going to talk a little bit about some of the potential for those and how a standardized test with Dan or Darren, how many students take CATS now, just before you start?
So it's 750,000 a year.
So that's a very large number when you're looking at your students in context with that, and the power of that is great. Anyway, Darren, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you, David, and thanks Andy and Tim for sharing your use of GL as well. So I just wanted to talk about Cat4 and how it can help with transition. We have had a lot of inquiries from schools and multi-academy trusts over the last couple of months, trying to understand what data they can get in the absence of national data to help form a picture about their pupils. And coming back to what David said right at the start, how can they know their students better? Spot potential. Yes, prediction of grades is important, but understanding how they can put the right strategies in place for pupils. And that's what Cat4 can help you to do. It is the most widely used standardised test of reasoning abilities, and it covers areas that are known to make a difference to learning and achievement. Those abilities are verbal reasoning, non-verbal reasoning, quantitative and spatial, which I'll cover in a minute. But spotting the potential achievement can help provide a consistent baseline at transition in year 7, as it can in other year groups as well, but particularly for year 7 this year. And that'll help make valid decisions around grouping and next steps for pupils. So I'm just going to talk through some of the data that's provided in Cat4. We'll have a mixture of CAT users and non-CAT users on the call today, so hopefully I can provide a picture of how Cat4 can help. So just talking about indicators initially, based on the statistical relationship between Cat4 scores and both SATs and GCSEs, we're able to give a picture of how pupils would perform based on their CAT score. And that is based on the statistics which we verify every single year. So the last verification was done in 2019, so all of this is as up to date as it can be. So the ability to look at scaled scores retrospectively based on CAT scores is available in the report. So you'll see here we've got 6 pupils based on their CAT score, which is the mean SAS in the table there, the standard age score, that's the standardized score. You can get an idea of pupils' ability at the primary level in terms of their SAT scores. So using that data alongside any other data, as Tim mentioned, he's getting a lot of data from primaries already, it just gives another angle for triangulation and give you a better understanding of the pupils. Similarly, going forward, again, based on the statistics, we can provide indicators around GCSE. You'll notice that they're all on numbers now based on the latest GCSEs, slight refinement on maths and English as well. So you can get an understanding of if the pupils stayed on the track they are currently, what they're likely to achieve at GCSE. Also, just in terms of ranking pupils, so you'll see here we've got the 4 abilities within CAT that are measured. Quantitative, basically being able to solve problems numerically. Verbal, obviously having an understanding of language and good reading. Non-verbal, around problem solving, just using pictures, not words or numbers. And spatial, just some pupils have the ability to visualize things in 3D. They tend to do well at STEM subjects, sciences, engineering, etc. So it just gives you that good perspective of their ability in 4 areas. But you'll notice there we have GR, which is group ranking. Having that overall group ranking can give you an understanding of how to set pupils, how to put them in the right groups based on their overall ability. Also, it can help you understand which pupils could catch up quicker than others. So for example, with a high quantitative score, if pupils are behind with the maths curriculum, if they've got a higher score, they probably need less support going forward in terms of catching up on that curriculum material, whereas those with the lower score may need further support. So it can help you understand pupils who need that further support. And as David said before, actually understanding behaviours, attitudes to learning, the way that pupils learn, the diagnostic information within CAT based on their profile across those 4 ability areas can help you understand how grouped together pupils can learn in slightly different ways and to get the best out of their ability, which will eventually improve their outcomes. So all of that diagnostic information is available in CAT. So it's not all just about indicators, it's understanding how you can help those pupils going forward and get the best out of them. I just wanted to talk a little bit about triangulation of data. So both Andy and Tim touched on that. You're going to have a lot of your own data, and understanding that overall picture of a pupil is really important. It's not just about one set of data. So GL data is standardized data, which will give you an extra dimension on a pupil on top of the data that you already have. Using some of our other assessments, you can basically understand the difference between their current attainment and their ability. So the couple of tables we've got on the screen there show the CAT score, so what their ability is, and then what their attainment was. So we've got NGRT, which is our reading test. If you looked at Ella Marie, for example, her ability, verbal ability is 99, which is average, 100 is the bang on average. But her attainment at reading at this current stage is 90 based on her score in the reading test. So you've got that common assessment language so that you can understand gaps. Moving on to September, that may be because of the impact of learning at home and not being face-to-face with the teachers. It could be a gap that could be closed, but at least it gives you an understanding of where they are right there, and basically are they achieving or underachieving or even overachieving. So it just gives you that extra dimension in terms of whole pupil view. So just to finish off with some stats, just to show you how reliable to make valid decisions CAT data is. You'll see there the standardization, originally standardized on just under 25,000 pupils. As I mentioned, we verify this data every single year so that it's performing as it should and we're getting the same consistent results year on year. There's some numbers there on how many pupils we verify that. Reliability wise, for those who aren't familiar with reliability, 0.8 is classed as very good. It's based on if the pupil took the test again, would it perform exactly the same and provide very similar results? So 0.96 is very, very high in terms of reliability. And just to finish off, in terms of administration, paper or digital, it is a lengthy test broken down into 3 sessions. The reason it is that long is the longer a test is, the more reliable the data will give you. So once the test is taken over those 3 sessions, it will give you really reliable data that will allow you to make valid decisions. Just a couple of things to finish off with. FFT was mentioned, I think, by Andy, and we do have a partnership with them, and they are looking to put CAT data into some of their reports moving forward. So we will have some webinars coming up on that soon, which we can make everyone aware of. We've also got a partnership with WAND now as well. So in terms of moving pupil data into our systems to get them set up quickly, that is now in place. Because of the administration, obviously, is something that can cause headaches, but that makes things a lot smoother. So I hope that's given you a good insight into CAT, and we'll move back to David.
Thank you very much, Darren, and thank you for that. We move to the question and answer part of the session now, and what we'll do is we've obviously been following people on chat, and a number of people have been replying, so I'll go around the panelists and ask for their responses. A few observations for me. That reliability as a predictor figure that Darren did is quite remarkable at 0.96. I mean, I think we probably know that SATs are a less good predictor, but to me, as I said at the beginning, it's not just their ability to predict that's important. It's what you do and how you can change things for the better for students by having hypotheses to test and getting to know students better than you know them in a way just by seeing them in a classroom, because sometimes they can exhibit things and behaviors, and particularly with the emphasis on writing, that may hide their talents. I was really interested when Andy talked about looking at baselines beyond mathematics and English, in art, for example. And I think sometimes we neglect looking at wider talents and aptitudes. And I think that's a territory that's worth greater exploring. There's lots of provocations in the questions about when you should do these tests, whether primary should be enlisted to do them, whether students bounce back by October and that would be a better time to reflect on too. And of course, Hilary began the session by a provocation to us all that overnight we moved into an online learning environment for all of our students, rather than it was something that some schools and individual teachers were passionate about. And I suppose the weighting, and we found this in some of our whole ed webinars, was to setting work rather than using the online environment to communicate better too. And I think one of the interesting things, as we're uncertain as we move to September, is how we may have a more blended learning environment with a mixture of face-to-face and online. I'd be interested in some comments on that. So I'm going to go around each of our panelists, go to Andy first to respond to any questions that you've noticed on the chat, but also any observations that you'd like to add. Andy first.
Yeah, I certainly think Hilary's point about how the teacher can interact with the students. So we're using Microsoft Teams as our platform for delivery, and we're only just now really in a more deep way moving to live online sessions where students, like we're doing here, use the chat or the Q&A facility to engage. And so, because exactly as Hilary was saying, that is the key way in which as teachers we do assess in an ongoing way all of the time, isn't it? Is the interactions we have with the students and the responses we get from them. So I think that's kind of been the biggest gap for us in terms of our ability to see how our classes are progressing and to support them appropriately and to adapt the learning. I think the other thing is trying to, at the minute, just break everything down and just focus on 1 or 2 weeks at a time. So I know that particularly with some of our students who are coming back in those year groups where they can, we're talking about only coming in for the 4 days, and then you start using the 5th day to assess what has been learned and the progress that's been made, and therefore where we need to go next. Because I think that's the key sense of identifying where people are struggling, what we can do to help them, and then where we need to go next with the whole of the class. So I think that's kind of addressing the blended learning bit. I've answered a number of the questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you. And we will summarise those, Andy. We'll summarise the answers as well as part of the follow-up document. Is there anything else you'd want to highlight, or should I go to Tim?
No, I'm happy to.
Tim, is there anything else you'd like to respond to from questions you've read on the chat, or from the more general points arising from the session?
Well, similarly to Andy, I've been tapping away, which meant, Darren, I was being rather rude and not paying as much attention to you as I might have done. But this business of predicting is interesting, isn't it, that we're talking about? And we are conscious, as far as we can, to never, particularly through Key Stage 3, cast forward to Key Stage 4. We're worried, we're focusing on children getting better from whatever their starting point is. And there's some very strong opinions in the chat about the nature of grouping and how this kind of information is used to determine children's future, isn't it? In a way that sometimes one might feel a bit uncomfortable about. So we're always very strong on the business of you're trying to beat that best. You're trying to always get better from that point you started. That's what we really like about the GL progress tests, that actually, because you've got a standardized score on a national basis, every child has the opportunity to do better than they did before, and that's what we're aspiring to. and we don't start that conversation in year 7 of saying, right, well, you've come in and we're very fortunate, we've got 12 different pieces of data on you, and because we've got lots of data, we can average it, and therefore it makes it nice and reliable, and therefore that means you're going to get a 6. That's statistically balmy, because Darren's points about the accuracy are right. If I took 1,000 children and I averaged it out, who started with 103 in a verbal cat, you might get a sense of what progress, what outcomes would look like. But the reality is that's a bell curve, isn't it? If you're not in the number who sit in the middle, you've got a huge side either way. And so to use that to determine children's mindsets at the start of year 7 strikes me and us as a school as completely wrong. So we never use this for any form of flight path. And I find it tricky when they make that transition in year 9. We're a 3-year Key Stage 3. So when we're looking at the options process, and of course, children are asking that question of, okay, what grade does that mean I'm likely to get? And you have to start subtly shifting the way you talk about it, but we avoid it as much as possible because we want children just to get better at the things they're learning wherever they've started from.
Tim, I think that's a powerful thing. This brings in the whole ethics of use of data and how you use it. I think I always say there's a strong cultural dynamic that you put into play here, because the ethos and values of a school and how you use information and data are very powerful, because data can be used to cap, as you said, cap youngsters'
and
expectations.
And we have we're a very mixed comprehensive in terms of our parent body. There are a lot of our parents, for whom we compete for their children with some big local, nationally famous private schools, and they send us their children because they trust us to do a certain type of job. And these are parents who've been savvy about scores and assessments in terms of their number for many years. We have to train those parents into a way of thinking, our way of thinking, that isn't determined purely by, did your child get 117 in their maths stat, and did that mean they beat another child? On the other end of the spectrum, we have parents for whom they've not got the slightest interest. So we have to manage all of that in our process of dealing with it. So a thing that I always quote about you, David, is this business of being, you've used the word pragmatopian. We have a utopian view of the way we want to use assessment, but that confronts reality in a number of areas, and we have to stick to our principle as much as we can, while accepting that we have a parental body who do care about their children getting 9s and just getting 9s and getting 9s, that's all that matters. And an environment that operates around us in terms of accountability measures that ain't going to go away just because we've got a year of no Key Stage 2 test scores.
Tim, that reminds me of when I first introduced the notion of value added. I thought I'd try and explain it to students in assembly. And this is the progress, and somebody put this on the chat, the difference between progress and expectations and attainment. And it is a real debate, because what does a progress score mean to a child? Very little. And I remember trying to explain value added to an assembly, and one of our students came up to me afterwards and said, I think I get this. It means you come out less thick from this school, which was not quite, it was a version of the school aim, convincing every student they could achieve more than they first thought. I want to go to Lisa for a moment, because on the issue of transition, Lisa has the privilege of talking probably more than any of us to schools around the country, even in a virtual way at the moment. Although her miles on her car have gone right down, Lisa's virtual miles are probably as big as ever. Lisa, do you want to add anything on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm sorry, I sort of, my internet failed for a moment then. I think the thing that's really important is there's an opportunity to see, what do we really want to find out about the students? And I think there's that opportunity for all schools to go back to basics. What is it that they wish they had known, or that they wish they now knew about the young people coming through? And I think things like the CAT, and I don't know if this has already been mentioned, but things like the CAT score, allowing to see the actual ability of the young people. I know there was a comment about all testing being a snapshot in time, but I think that you've got that opportunity there, not only to see what are their their learned ability, but also what's their natural ability. And I think in a time where gaps may be sort of not as evident, or groups where gaps form are not as evident as before, it will be really important to make sure that you've got a variety of sort of assessments to find out what you need to know about the young people. And I think that that's how our schools are approaching it, even though it's unknown, that they want to embrace a variety of different ways of assessing the young people coming up, both academic and attitudinally.
Well, we're coming up to our first break. Hilary, is there anything you want to add from what you've seen on the chat?
I just wanted to concur with what Tim and Lisa just said, is that although CAP does give you a score, a standardized score and indicators for grades, it's really when it's used, as you said, David, as information that gives more about the child, so you can better help them, that you can better support them. That's when we really see it, in my view, be used to its best ability. It's not just about that number. It's about understanding Darren's point that if a child has really strong quantitative ability, they might catch up far quicker in maths than if they don't. It's things like that that give you an insight into how that child will behave and how best to support them. And I don't like to see it reduced to just a score that you're going to use for targets or the like.
I think the quality and the reliability to me is about trust in the data. And that I think can strengthen teacher assessment and teacher advice, because they, in a sense, it provides a validation which is quite powerful. It's not just my judgment, it is backed up by, but also I think it gives the teacher's brain a source of information, because we're expecting teachers to make an awful lot of very sophisticated judgments on what you see in front of you or a written piece of work. And this is the power of the thing to me. And I think it's working at a teacher level is something we perhaps underplayed sometimes. Okay,
David, can I add something on that?
Yeah, by all means, and then we'll
picking up a few things in the chat about questions of how you understand this now about a child who might have got a certain score in Key Stage 2 because of support, but who can't get that sort of provision in Year 7, and how do we work with teachers on it? And undeniably, that's still a big flaw in the way that we are not just data rich, but information rich about students. But if I were to be dead honest, and if I were to roll out a historian who teaches our place 26 out of 30 periods a week and said, could you chat to David about how we use CAPs and transition tests? I would look as if I knew what I was talking about. And we've worked at that hard over the last couple of years, but of course it sits alongside all those other things we're trying to train our teachers in. So it's that's for me the big challenge in those of us who are schools who do a lot of this work with GM.
Thanks, Tim. I'm going to stop you because I'm determined that we stay on time. But I think that taking it to a teacher level is something we should stay with us. And it's also where Andy mentioned the simplicity earlier on. And I think that's one of the trends, is that we can overload on data, then you don't see the wood for the trees. And I think one of the role of a leader is to make it fit for purpose, for the purpose it's being used by the individual teacher it's being used by. I'm going to close the session though. We've kept to time. It's approaching 10 o'clock. This is our first virtual break, and I'll be interesting on the chat to hear interesting things people have done in the virtual break. We're going to be back in 15 minutes, and in the 15 minutes we'll be looking at the notion of gaps for other students. And one of the great powers of data is to notice better the students we don't notice immediately. I always think that the extremes we notice very clearly and are pretty good at responding to often, but it's about a more granular thing. And of course, particular groups and year groups emerge when we look at gaps and issues arising from the lockdown. We'll be back in 15 minutes. Go and enjoy your virtual break. Do tweet on the hashtag WE assessment. Do keep adding comments on the chat, questions, observations, and provocations. We'll be back in 15 minutes.